I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would like to thank the external funders of the Institute, Havana Capital, Maytree, the Neptus Foundation, the City of Toronto, the Region of Halton, Region of York, and the Region of Durham. Thanks also to our staff at IMFG, Cassin Piali and Amy Wang at Hart House for helping to organize this event and making it run smoothly. And I know it's going to run smoothly. If you are tweeting about this event, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFG Toronto. Toronto is facing unprecedented budget challenges. The impact of the pandemic, inflation, a rising infrastructure deficit, high interest rates, and climate change will only increase the financial pressures in the future. The federal and provincial governments did help out during the pandemic, but this year, neither has provided the transfers that the city had hoped for at the time of its 2023 budget. Toronto has few own source revenue options to respond to the financial pressures it faces. It relies mainly on property taxes, the municipal land transfer tax, some smaller taxes, and user fees. This situation has led the city to look for other potential sources of revenue. At IMFG, we are asked all the time, what do other cities do? What other revenues do other cities have? What taxes do they levy? So to answer that question, today we have brought together a panel of international experts who will tell us what other cities do. They will explore what works, what doesn't work, and what could be applied in Toronto. So let me introduce our panelists to you now. Their bios are on the website, so I'm not going to spend time going into detail. We have François Vaillancourt, who is Emeritus Professor in the Department of Economics at the Université de Montréal and a fellow at the Inter-University Research Center in Analysis of Organizations, known as CIRANO. We have Andrew Reschovsky, who is Professor Emeritus of Public Affairs and Applied Economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we have Antti Moisio, who's a senior economist at the OECD Center of Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities. We're also happy today that we are joined by Toronto's Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer, Heather Taylor, who will provide some opening remarks to set the stage for us. So Heather will speak first, then the panelists. After the presentations, I will have a discussion with the panelists, and then we will have time for a few questions from the audience. So I would ask that you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send in questions at any point during the presentations. So I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the panel today, and I'd like to now turn it over to Heather Taylor to set the stage for us. Heather.
Thank you, Enid. I'm pleased to virtually join everyone today, and I think this event is incredibly timely for the city. And so, Enid, you just commented and set really great context with regards to what the city is currently challenged by. I think if anyone was looking at the city's 2023 annual budget, there was a significant narrative around the significant and unprecedented financial challenges brought to light in part by COVID, in the sense of 2023 is the fourth year of financial impacts attributed to COVID from lost revenues as well as increased costs. And as we plan for 2024, we know that the implications of COVID are going to be felt for years to come. An example of that, just to give people a sense of what we're dealing with, the sense of ridership. Transit ridership, because the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, is run by the city. It is partially funded from the fare box, and transit ridership has declined substantially from a pre-COVID scenario. The post-COVID world and the realities of working from home, as well as just living in other jurisdictions and local entities. So I would say that the COVID pressures are substantial. And then in addition to that, as Enid mentioned, I think also impacts of the pandemic. We all know that inflation was triggered, escalations in interest rates, volatile markets, as well as global supply chain disruptions. And now I think over the last couple of years, specialized labor shortages are just another factor of challenge that is impacting the city. You know, that all coupled with growing demands on services, unanticipated legislative changes for the city, as well as a year where there is substantial uncertainty with regards to funding from our intergovernmental partners, so the federal and the provincial. So for those of you outside of Canada, where we were talking about national and subnational governments. So looking ahead to future years, the city anticipates continued challenges in the development of our budget and the growing financial, operating, and capital demands due to the growth aspects of the city, increased population in the city. Also, a factor of that is inflation. In March, just a couple of months ago, we presented an updated financial model to our council, which assessed the long-term financial risks anticipated in the next 10-year period. What made this report very unique was that it's the first time that we've actually taken a consolidated perspective of both operating and capital requirements that represent what the city has committed to, what council has made commitments to over the next 10 years. That total pressure is $46.5 billion over the next 10 years. Now, realizing some of that is attributed to the new scenario that I just mentioned in regards to coming out of COVID. But I will say, and I think it's important to understand, that this pressure that I just mentioned, $46.5 billion, is a accumulation of scenarios and commitments that have evolved over several decades and aren't going to be solved overnight, but they have been accelerated because of the pandemic. And so the key here is that it's not really just a long-term financial plan or problem. We know that that problem actually is going to surface as soon as 2024. I say that because we, of course, have felt the significance of the pressures in 2023. But over the last few years, we've been able to create a COVID reserve from the strong real estate market that existed pre-COVID. And we have been able to weather the storm thus far. But in the event in 2023, in the absence of any government supports to help offset these pressures, our savings will be completely depleted. And so that's why this is really important, is that if those savings are depleted as we go into our planning cycle for 2024, we have nothing to fall back on in the event that any of those assumptions don't come forward. So the reality is, as much as it's a long-term financial plan, we have short-term financial issues. And I think in order to mitigate these financial pressures, we are looking at opportunities related to either expanded revenue tools, new revenue tools. So today's discussion is perfect in its timing. When we think about revenue tools, what I think is really important is to understand the legislative context and financial framework that municipalities function under in Canada. Right now, Toronto has a $16 billion annual operating budget and a $50 billion 10-year capital plan. What makes us a bit unique is that the size of the city is actually larger than half the provinces in Canada, but we are restricted by local government rules. And one of those rules is that we must have a balanced budget. And unfortunately, even if we could have an unbalanced budget, we don't have the revenue tools to address an operating deficit. And so I'm sure that most of you know from previous IMFG events, Toronto is governed by this provincial legislation. And specifically, we do have a City of Toronto Act that gives us permission to do or to administer and introduce certain revenue tools. But in many instances, we do need the cooperation of the province to ensure that they are implemented appropriately. In the absence of all of that, we will be looking at other options with regards to the asset structure of the city, as well as service levels that have been committed to, services that we offer. In some instances, we've dipped our toes and we offer services that really are extensions of responsibilities of other orders of government. And so we know that the solution to these financial pressures are going to be a combination, a myriad of solutions, from revenue tools to expenditure to service impacts, etc. I do think, though, understanding what the drivers of the pressures are is essentially very, very important. I've mentioned transit. In pre-COVID times, the fare box associated with our transit system paid for about 2/3, 66% of the overall operating costs of the transit system. Now, in addition to return to the office, we are seeing decreased ridership, but the fare box only covering probably around 38% of the overall operations of the transit system. So looking at the framework, we know that there needs to be a new operating framework for transit here in Toronto, specifically given the fact that Toronto services the Greater Toronto Area, which is the economic driver for the province as well as for Canada. In addition to that, our shelter system had less than, in pre-COVID times, we had less than 6,000 shelter beds every night. We have over 9,000 people in our shelter system every single night. So those are two significant pressures that are drivers to our financial pressures that in many instances are outside of our immediate control. And so I think today's event couldn't come at a better time. We are returning to our council in July with the second phase of our long-term financial plan, with a menu of options and some recommendations around what council and a new mayor, given an election on June 26th, should be contemplating as we go into our 2024 planning cycle. We are always looking for inspiration on a global basis and on best practices on how we can promote financial sustainability. And I'm looking really, really forward to the great panelists' perspectives that are going to be shared today. And Enid, thank you for inviting the City of Toronto to listen in, because this is really, really important.
Great. Thank you very much, Heather. Some people had a little trouble hearing you, and I'm sorry about that. I didn't want to interfere to try to change the technical stuff in a short presentation. But you did say that the operating budget of the City of Toronto is $16 billion. It sounded a bit like 60, so I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you very much for setting the stage for us. I set out some of the general parameters, but you've given us a much better understanding of the pressures that the city is facing in the short run and in the long run. So thank you very much, Heather. So we're going to go from close to far. We're going to start with François Vaillancourt in Montreal, go to Andy Reschovsky in the US, and Antti Moisio in Europe. So François, if you could give us some comments, please.
Yes, and we have 5 minutes, so it's not going to be very long comments. 3 points I'd like to make. First of all, looking at the largest cities of each province in Canada, work done with Jean-Philippe Meloche for the Institute of Enid in 2021, the tax on real property is the main source of revenue for all these cities except Saskatoon. Saskatoon sells natural gas, if I remember correctly. So they have a very important sales of goods and services income. But when you look actually more carefully, what you find is that that's the main trade-off. Cities that happen to be running hydro, electricity, local utilities, whatever, they'll have a lower share of tax on real property. Other ones have a higher share. The highest share in Canada is found in Halifax at 72.6% of total revenues for 2018. And the lowest, as I said, was Saskatoon. But then there's not much else. You don't really find anything above 4% of revenue business tax in Winnipeg. So not much to be learned really from the experience of all other cities in Canada as such. So let me turn a bit more narrowly to the case of the province of Quebec. If we go beyond Montreal, could we say something? Well, the province of Quebec has recently decided to go back to the future. That is that until 1980, cities in Quebec receive 1/4 of the revenue from the Quebec provincial sales tax, a typical North American retail sales tax. This was abolished. They were given better access to property tax. The school boards were bumped out of it, and the school boards will be financed by grants from the province. Various things happened afterwards, but leaving that aside, decision was made to give the cities a share of the growth of the Quebec value-added tax. Now it's a value-added tax, of a share of the growth of 1% of the revenues, 1 percentage point of tax. Not much. So it's not the total amount. It's that we're giving you the growth associated to a share of our tax revenue, which is 10%, because the rate is 9.975. About 100 millions right now shared between all the cities. So, but still, it's not controlled by them. The rates are set by the province, but it is a different revenue source from that found in other provinces. Now, drilling down to Montreal, Montreal is still not happy, of course. There was a revenue expenditure forum sur la fiscalité in November 2022, which various people participated, including Jean-Philippe Monoche, myself, the Good Boo, and other experts in Quebec. And of course, the issue was we'd like more revenue. But also we'd like to be required to spend less. And the argument was that various laws required that the city of Montreal carry out spending activities that were not required of others. One clear example is police services. Police services are allocated various requirements in terms of services, or basic municipal policing, somewhat specialized, some crime, and the top level of policing services is offered by the Quebec Provincial Police, the Sûreté du Québec. The city of Montreal is supposed to have services very much equivalent to what the Sûreté du Québec offers free of charge outside of Montreal. So anti-terrorist or specialized crime units, and therefore are not subsidized in Montreal, are subsidized. That was one issue that was raised. Another issue that was raised was spending on not legally required, but used to be financed by the province activities, such as first responders. Financing is cut off, but the city keeps doing it. And finally, could we think of perhaps other revenue sources? Fees, which are the obvious one, were not released. Okay, user fees not released. And in closing, an extra point linked to what Eder was mentioning, downtown, we're about at 75–80% of the ridership on the Montreal transit system right now. We therefore have a structural deficit. Apparently, the structural deficit would exist even if we were back up to pre-COVID ridership. Recent numbers were argued to show that. And downtown is indeed fairly empty Monday and Friday, somewhat busier Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but still a lot working. And the issue that's pointed out, this is terrible, where will the tax revenue come from? The property values in downtown drop. Well, If people have their offices in their house, why shouldn't they pay more property tax revenue for their home plus office structure, not in downtown? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Francois. I think you've raised some interesting points that when you were studying other revenue sources for municipalities in Quebec or in Montreal, that it came to a discussion of what responsibilities they should have, because of course that's where we start. What should they be doing, and then how to pay for it. Also interesting that they get a share of the growth of the sales tax, being careful to say that the right way, a share of the growth. And the controversial idea of taxing people's residences for the business portion of their houses. So thank you very much. And so over to the United States and what's going on there, Andy.
Thank you, Enid. Enid asked me to talk about what lessons Toronto may be able to learn from the financing of large American central cities. In other words, have American cities been successful in diversifying their revenue sources? Let me start by saying that local governments in Canada are similar to those in the United States in the sense that they are creations of their state governments. State governments must authorize the use of any local revenue source. Also, most state governments limit local government fiscal autonomy by placing restrictions on tax rates, on revenue growth, and on spending. Given that there are 50 states, it's not surprising there's lots of variation in what cities across the US can and cannot do. Despite these similarities, American local governments differ in important ways from local governments in Canada, or at least in Ottawa and Toronto. In the US, K-12 education is a local government function. A bit over a third of expenditures in large American central cities go to education, public education. This means that there's less money available for other types of spending. For example, while in Toronto, about 27% of city expenditures goes towards transportation, this figure is only about 8% in the average American central city. It's really important to understand that the structure of local governments in the US is highly complex. Municipal governments spend money on public safety, roads, sanitation, other services. Spending on education for city residents, however, is often provided by independent school districts with their own taxing powers. Overlying county governments often provide a range of social services, and special district governments are sometimes responsible for housing and transportation. To deal with these differences in governmental structure across cities, two colleagues and I have developed the concept of fiscally standardized city, or FISCs. The resulting database allows us to compare revenues and spending across 150 large American cities, and I'm going to talk about those FISCs. About 95% of FISC revenue come from three sources. On average, 35% come from transfers from state and federal governments, 39% from locally levied taxes, and 29% from user charges. Interestingly, these percentages are strikingly similar to Toronto's revenue shares. It is important, however, to emphasize that the mix of revenues from different sources varies tremendously across US cities. For example, the share of revenue from transfer ranges from a low of 14% in one city to a high of 71% across those 150 cities. As in Toronto and most American central cities, the property tax is the single most important source of revenue. On average, across the 150 American central cities, about 40% of locally raised revenue come from the property tax, with the property tax contributing about 2/3 of local tax revenue. In a number of cities, especially in the New England states, the property tax revenue makes up well over 90% of total tax revenue. What other state taxes are used? First, most FISCs raise some revenue from selective sales taxes. These are taxes levied on the sale of specific goods or services. They're often referred to as excise taxes. In the US, common examples are local taxes on alcoholic beverages, on tobacco products, on live performances, on movie theater tickets, and on public utilities. Also, quite common are taxes associated with participating in various occupations, operating certain businesses, operating motor vehicles. These are referred to as license taxes. The contributions from these types of taxes to local city revenue, however, tends to be quite modest. Significant revenue diversification only comes from levying a local government general sales tax or an individual income tax. In states that allow these taxes, state governments generally provide their local governments with the option to impose a sales tax or a local income tax. In the case of sales tax, state governments either specify the local rate or set a maximum allowable tax rate. 123 of the 150 cities in the FIS database raise revenues from the general sales tax, an individual income tax, or both. Local option sales taxes are quite common. They're found in 114 of the 150 central cities. In the cities using them, they contribute about 21% of total tax revenue. Income taxes are used much less frequently. They provide revenue in only 23 cities. However, in the cities where they're used, they contribute on average 29% of tax revenue. And in 9 cities, including New York, Philadelphia, and Detroit, revenue is raised from both a local sales and a local income tax. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Well, that gives us a really good view of the cities in the U.S. And you've also raised the governance issues, of course, because you've talked about the overlying counties and districts and what they do and how that all fits in. And interesting that many of the taxes you mentioned, we can levy in Toronto, you know, entertainment taxes, taxes on alcohol, vehicle registration, et cetera. But as you say, they don't bring in a lot of money. What we can't do in Toronto is levy an income or sales tax. So that's an interesting difference. So now we're going to go over across the ocean to evening in Europe and to Antti.
Thank you, Enid, and good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. I'm very happy to attend. And in my brief remark, I will discuss some examples of municipal income tax. So according to OECD revenue statistics, about 42% of OECD countries permit subnational governments to levy income taxes as source of revenue. There are, of course, many more countries that share the central government income tax revenue between central government and subnational governments. But I will focus on countries where subnational governments have their own income tax and have the right to set tax rates, either completely freely or within set boundaries. And among the OECD, there are only a handful of countries where income tax revenue forms a major part of subnational tax revenue. These countries comprise the five Nordic countries: Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, and Norway, and one Baltic state, Latvia. In these countries, income tax forms more than 80% of subnational tax revenue. Just as an example, in Sweden, income tax is the only tax revenue for municipalities and regions. So why is income tax so important revenue source for municipal and regional governments in the Nordics? There are many explanations, I guess, but I think the main reason is that, especially in the Nordic countries, subnational governments have been assigned very demanding tasks, such as all healthcare, all social services, welfare support, and all education except universities. And of course, they are responsible for the usual subnational government tasks, such as local infrastructure, water, sewage, and environmental protection, and so on. In fact, Nordic countries have decentralized almost everything except national defense and universities, to exaggerate just a little bit. To fund such services requires at least one big tax base, as property tax alone is not enough. I think that's the one reason. Another reason is that subnational governments have a very strong constitutional status, and their fiscal independence and taxing rights are protected by the legal system. In such a framework, subnational funding system cannot be founded on central government grants and shared tax revenue alone. So I will take a few examples from my own country, Finland. As in other Nordic countries, most municipal tax revenue in Finland is raised through the local tax on personal income, around 84% in 2020. Although municipalities also raise revenue from property tax, and they receive a share of central government's corporate tax revenue. But the share of property taxes of total municipal revenue is only around 2.5%. In Finland, a dual income tax system has been applied since 1993. This divides personal income into two components, the capital income and earned income. And capital income is currently taxed at a flat rate of 30% by central government. Earned income is subject to central government income tax at progressive rates and to municipal taxes at proportional rates. And in addition, there are social security contributions. While the municipal income tax in Finland is a proportional tax, over the years, central government has established tax allowances for persons with low incomes, and this has made the municipal tax more like a progressive tax. While municipal income tax base is determined by central government, municipalities have full control over the tax rates as there are no upper or lower limits. In recent years, roughly 1 in 6 municipalities raised their income tax rates every year by year, partly as a response to decreasing tax bases and partly because of increasing spending assignments and because of the hike in public sector wages. Municipal income tax rate has been steadily rising during the past decades in Finland. It should be noted, however, that every year there are also municipalities that lower their income tax rates. Municipalities look closely what their neighbors do, and this probably limits the increases local income tax rates. In 2021, the highest municipal income tax rate applied was 23.5%. The mean tax rate was 21%, and the lowest tax rate applied was 16.5%. Finally, it should be mentioned that all local tax bases, including income tax base, are subject to fiscal equalization. In rough terms, if the per capita tax capacity is below the average, the municipality will receive equalization grant, and the compensation rate is 80% of the difference. If the municipal per capita tax capacity is above the national average, the municipality is charged a compensation payment which amounts to 30% of the difference. So I stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Antti. We always look to the Nordic countries because they do deliver social services and they do have an income tax, and it seems to work well there. So thank you for explaining that to us. We do have some questions coming in, but let me just ask you each a question first. Let me start with Francois. So you mentioned the paper you wrote for IMFG with Jean-Philippe Meloche a few years back, where you looked at revenue sources in 10 cities across Canada. I think it was the largest city in each province. You've talked a little bit about the findings, but given what you found, what do you think Toronto should consider when it's assessing new revenue sources? You need to unmute. You need to unmute.
Well, given the history of Toronto, they've had a very nice idea a few years ago of a fee to enter the city for cars, which was shot down by the province, I think, within 2 days of it being put forward. So cities provide, although they talk a lot about individual-centered services, shelters and all that, cities provide fundamentally infrastructure-based type services linked to housing. Will protect you from fires, will protect you from robberies, will have roads that allow you to leave your house and go to work and so forth and so on. And the way to finance those kind of services is either as a premium on the property, because you think that higher value properties, are willing to pay more for fire protection, or through fees. So the idea of a road usage fee would strike me as making a lot of sense. You can do it directly by kilometers. You can do it indirectly by the fee on gasoline, the fee on electricity, or you can do it through parking fees because cars have to park somewhere. So as soon as they move out of your house, they're parked somewhere eventually, or just going around in a circle to get your kid to go to sleep. the exception. So fees.
Okay. There is a question here that sort of follows that, and I'm going to ask it from one of the listeners. Are there other cities that use municipal land transfer taxes or commercial parking levies that spur density on lands underused, such as surface parking lots? So, Andy, are there US cities that use land transfer taxes or commercial parking levies?
I am not aware of any cities that use land transfer taxes, although it's possible. They certainly are not a major source of revenue. And I'm also not certain about parking levies. Cities certainly levy taxes on parking and parking facilities.
Right.
Montreal and Halifax show a share of respectively 4% and 5% of land transfer tax in their 2018 revenue, to answer that question.
And Montreal also has a commercial parking levy, I believe.
Yes. Yeah. Also, there is a levy on parking, which is Jean-Philippe's argument is that it should be much more generalized. And you may find interesting that the borough of Rosemont-Petite-Patrie has decided to use its annual parking sticker to make it a function of the size of the car, roughly, arguing that bigger cars occupy a larger share of public space when they're parked and therefore should pay more.
Right. Antti, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about Finland. And you talked about social services, and the local governments are, Finland is a unitary country, right? So it's the national government and local governments. There's no provincial or state government in the middle. So social services are at the local level, but I gather there's a difference between whether it's a regional or local responsibility, and what are the implications for the municipal income tax of the recent change that happened there?
Yes, thank you. There is a very important reform in Finland, very new reform. Actually, since beginning of this year, the government launched counties. There are now 23 counties, and these are responsible for health and social services. So these were actually transferred from municipalities to counties. Counties will be fully funded by central government. They don't have their own tax at all. So that has been debated. That was one option, was for the government to establish a regional or county tax, but that was not supported by the majority in the parliament. So that's postponed the very least. So, but I don't think that in the medium term there will be changes in municipal tax revenues, even though their service menu has decreased radically. I mean, health and social services meant half of their budget, and that's gone now. So I suppose at some point the government will need to consider a bigger reform of municipal revenue system.
Okay, so not just here, other places are considering municipal revenue reform too. Andy, in the US, some US cities are able to levy more taxes than the property tax. And you mentioned many levy sales taxes, some levy income taxes. How do you convince state, in our case, provincial and national governments, of the value of tax sharing or of providing new revenue sources to cities?
I think in the US, first, I'll start by saying that there's not much history, almost no history of tax sharing. That's not a US phenomena. Most of the action is in the form of states authorizing local governments and city governments to levy a tax. The tax can often be administered by the state, but it's not a real tax sharing scheme. Looking at the history, unfortunately, I think the only way that in most states that authorization happens to expand tax revenue is if there's a fiscal crisis. And one can point to a number of examples where there's been resistance in the state legislature for allowing cities to expand, to diversify revenue, and then a crisis occurs. One thing that's playing out now in the state of Wisconsin is that the city of Milwaukee, so the politics are politics that we find in many American states were the Republicans against the Democrats. The cities tend to be Democratic. The legislatures tend to represent more rural areas, which are heavily Republican. And in the current political environment, there's a lot of antithesis from legislatures towards cities. But nevertheless, in Wisconsin, it looks like there's going to be a big pension crisis, that the city won't be able to, has its own pension system as opposed to the other cities. But Milwaukee is quite different, and they won't be able to pay pensions, or they'll have to cut massive cuts, and they're talking about fiscal cliffs, massive cuts in services. And so the legislature has now said they may allow a local option sales tax for Milwaukee, but the legislation as it's currently, this is all in play now, hasn't been passed yet, would put lots of restrictions on how the city government could spend the money, and other sort of restrictions. And at the moment, the legislation calls for a local referenda to add a 2% sales tax, and the city officials are afraid that the referenda wouldn't pass. So they're caught in a very difficult place, but it really took a fiscal crisis for even the discussion to be on the table.
Right. Interesting. Thank you. Just for people listening, the difference between tax sharing and providing new revenue sources to cities. Tax sharing means a certain percentage of provincial or federal taxes would be given to municipalities, and it's often done on a per capita basis. But providing tax sources is the municipalities saying, we will levy our own tax rate. That's not to say we would have, local sales taxes or local income taxes. They would likely piggyback onto the provincial or federal taxes, but the local governments would determine what that rate is, and that would make it a more local tax than if it was, shared equally across the board. So we have some questions.
I just add one more point about the U.S. that often the state is setting the rate of like a local sales tax, but the difference is that it is an option tax. So not all local governments, they'll give local governments the option of having a sales tax, but it can only be at 1% or 1.5%.
Right. And it was also interesting when Auntie was talking about income taxes, because, one of the fears here is that, people will move out of a municipality into another one that doesn't have a local income tax. But what Auntie was saying, everybody looks at everybody else's taxes and they try not to be out of line with each other so that you don't have that kind of movement. So some of the questions from the audience. Here's one. I wonder whether regulatory charges using existing powers could serve as an equivalent to excise taxes. Appropriately priced permits for stores that sell or serve alcohol, etc. Seems like an untapped resource, at least in Alberta. And just to follow on, just to add on, you can also get the regulatory benefit of discouraging certain types of behavior. What do you think about that? Francois,
If you discourage the behavior, you won't have any revenue. So that's the first observation. I think that's really, it's an original idea. I've never seen that one before, maybe even as I haven't seen it. I would be extremely hard to put in place. I can imagine stores splitting off into various subparts where I say, well, this is not subject to this tax and that. If you go back to when we were discussing the goods and service tax, the Canadian VAT, back in the 80s, there was a very in-depth paper defining what a store was, which was quite interesting. And I suspect that provinces would put a stop to it, or courts would say that it's beyond the power of a normal permit as a regulatory blah, 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 and you're trying to turn it into a tax. But having said that, I mean, Andrew was discussing specific U.S. city taxes as opposed to general ones. I don't know. Maybe they do that in the States for specific goods.
I think the U.S. example, they never think of them as regulatory taxes, but these they tend to be called license taxes. So that if you want to practice a profession or you want to be a hairdresser, you need to pay a fee, a tax each year. But there's a regulatory component because with that tax comes certain provisions. Not anybody can just, you have to pass certain exams and so forth in order to practice the occupation or profession.
Okay. So there's a quick question. So municipal receipts of shares of the gas tax or tax sharing. Just a quick answer on that. This is a Canadian program. The gas tax sharing is actually not based on the gas tax revenues. It's actually just a transfer from the federal government. It goes up by the rate of inflation every year. We call it the gas tax transfer, but it actually has nothing to do with gas tax revenues. And it's recently been renamed the Canada Community Building Fund. So just a quick answer to that question. There's a question, Andy, I think this is for you. In the US, special districts, how are the costs divided among participating municipalities? Is it on the basis of user pay?
So special districts are governments. They tend to be non-democratic governments that are set up to do certain things, often to run housing or environmental protection or run hospitals, for instance, and they tend to be regional, and the regions can be a county level government or even larger, and depending on what they do, the revenue sources are different. So many of them have property tax revenue. They're able to levy usually fairly low property tax rates to generate revenues. Others, for instance, hospital service relies primarily on fees, either directly patients or through federal health insurance. So there's lots of mixture, and it's hard to generalize.
Okay, thank you. So I have a number of questions here on land value capture. They're all asked in different ways. You know, development charges have been restricted in Ontario. There's a need for rapid housing growth. Just a whole lot of questions here on what do you think? You know, the property tax is a land value capture to some extent, but not entirely. What's your experience? What do you think about using more land value capture? Anybody want to comment on
that? I would, I think the general idea of land value capture is a good one. And obviously, particularly in circumstances where the city government is making decisions like expanding transit networks, the beneficiaries, if they're private property owners in the area of the transit network, are the big winners, as opposed to the citizens of the city of Toronto, in this case, and setting up mechanisms to tax some of that increment in value attributable to public investment is, I think, a very sensible way to generate revenue for cities.
Any examples? Does anyone have any examples of some good land value capture systems?
I think the most, I'm not an expert on this at all, but my former colleagues at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy have studied Latin America. And I think in Latin America, and particularly South America and Brazil, there in Sao Paulo, for instance, there are a lot of examples of using land value, and sometimes through the zoning regulations of saying zoning for 1 story, but if you want to build higher, which makes sense near a transit stop, then you have to pay extra fees. So there is a literature on that, but and there are not too many examples in the US, but mainly in Latin America.
That's right. And Sao Paulo is quite well known for land value capture mechanisms, and Belo Horizonte also does land value capture. Anybody else want to comment on that? No.
Well, I can just say that I'm not an expert in land value capture mechanisms, but I know that in Finland it is used quite extensively, and local municipalities get a revenue. They are quite active in land value capturing, and but I can't go into details too much because I don't know the instruments so well.
Okay, thank you. Lots of questions. As more and more retail commerce shifts online, creating a competitive and equity challenge to bricks and mortar based local property tax paying retailers, are there examples of local jurisdictions which have found ways to levy a charge or tax on commercial retail transactions, entailing use of the public right of way to complete the delivery of the purchased good to an address within the municipality? Francois, you're laughing. What do you think of that? Unmute, please.
I'm mute because I coughed. Thank God the question is not, can we tax the web transaction? This goes back to the comment I made on the user fees and roads. Roads are one of the big things that we provide in Canada. We build them, we maintain them, and we, at least in Montreal, we clear them from snow. Toronto, they call it in the army. But having said that, if you did that, little Amazon trucks that run around all over the place and do 100 kilometers per day on your local roads would pay a fee. And would the fee be based on the kilometer, on the size of the truck, on the amount of items delivered? I mean, we could have a discussion about that, but that's it. That's exactly the idea, that you are providing a service. What happened in the past is people drove to the shopping center provided the parking, and the city provided the road to the person going and back to the shopping center, and didn't charge them a fee except for the property tax. And now we're saying that the property tax is not capable of capturing enough of that. So kilometer-based fee system, we looked at it a few years ago in Cyrano, appear more and more feasible, technologically speaking. 20 years ago, it made no sense. And because of the electrical cars, the gasoline-based taxes of the provinces anyway are going to have to go, at one point, are going to have to change. In 20 years' time, if we don't have any new gas fuel cars in Canada in 20, 25 years' time, we won't have any gas tax revenue. Now, so the provinces will come in and the feds will come in and occupy that space, and why not have the cities occupy part of the space? And in a sense, it's a new space, so it should be easier to enter it than spaces already occupied by a given tax.
I might just add that the delivery system now creates all sorts of congestion costs within cities, not in the suburbs where the delivery van can pull into driveways and so forth. So there is, I think, an economic rationale for a city like Toronto to try to institute some sort of road-related tax related to delivery.
Well, they did. They were turned down by the province a number of years ago. So we got lots of comments in the Q&A. So your comment about road tolls spurred someone to say, this may spur a proliferation of drone-based delivery systems clogging our airspaces. So other questions. Here's one about the vacant homes tax. And my questions just moved on me. Toronto has introduced a vacant homes tax to discourage empty homes, and it is also a form of revenue for the city. Critics have said that the tax is not a viable or sustainable form of revenue. Are there American or European examples of a vacant homes tax, and what is the discussion there on this topic? Auntie, do you have vacant home taxes in European cities? I'm not aware of it.
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I would imagine that yes, but I really don't know for sure.
Okay.
By the way, as for land value capturing policies, I checked, and there is a very recent OECD report on the different policies in different countries. I sent it to chat, so
Oh, good.
maybe
Okay.
maybe Gus can share it.
We can share that. Yeah. Okay. Vacant homes tax. Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I mean, it is ironic that the discussions in urban finance about vacant homes used to be about the problems, and they still are in many cities, with vacant homes because they're dilapidated and very low value, and the owners aren't paying their taxes, even the existing property tax. And I think the new discussion is about pied de terre owned by rich folks who don't live in the city.
And on the land value taxes, there's a comment about Montreal using a land value contribution to fund a new transit system, DREM, but it's not Montreal. It's more generally all the areas, and it's linked to DREM. DREM will get the money. They're telling people you build new apartment building next to a REM station, we get to finance the cost of that. So it's not going to the coffers of the city as such.
Right.
I like the drones. I love ingenuity of the private sector. But then they have to land somewhere, so you can have a pad.
That's right. Okay, well, I think we're coming close to the end of our time here. There are more questions, but some of them were related to things we've already posed. Some of them were directed at Heather, but I thought we would leave Heather off the hook for now and just talk to our international panelists. So let me thank all of the panelists for participating in this important discussion today. And I'd also like to thank the audience, because really there were some terrific questions in there, and we will share all of the questions with the panelists after the event. We record all our events, so today's event has been recorded and it will be available on our website shortly. And I would ask that you share it with your colleagues who maybe couldn't attend today. So thanks again for coming. We will watch the City of Toronto's finances going forward with lots of interest, see what other revenue sources they may come up with. And again, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.